Well, a harder conversation is your family member is likely to die. Um, maybe tomorrow, maybe tonight, maybe in 2 hours' time, uh, or maybe after 2 weeks of a struggle. And we're going to have to go through all of this together, you and us and the patient. And this is not an easy journey. And it will be marked by ups and downs, and it will be marked by difficult conversations and by grief and loss and, highs and lows. And so the conversation about organ donation occurs after there have been a number of other conversations.
This is At a Loss, conversations hosted by me, Timothy Giles, with people I meet in my work as a funeral celebrant. Life and death, the experiences, emotions, issues, events that we all face, and some insights that can help when you feel at a loss. Stephen, thank you. It's taken, a couple of years, I think, to get to this conversation. And you're retired now.
I am finally.
Which you said we're not going to have the conversation until you are.
Yes.
So congratulations on achieving that.
Yeah, thank you. I still do a little voluntary work for what used to be the Auckland District Health Board, but I'm no longer employed and I'm no longer registered as a medical practitioner anymore. So in that sense, I'm certainly retired.
Can I look back on your career for a moment? And my key focus today is around organ donation and the complexities and some of the clarity around that. Professionally, how long were you focused, or have you been focused on organ donation?
Well, there are periods in my life where I've been more focused on it than others. And in the latter part of my career, I was very focused on it from about 2005, I suppose. But there have been other times before that when I was focused on it as well, at different times in its evolution in New Zealand. My first exposure was when I was a registrar, about 2 years out of medical school, working in the Department of Renal Medicine at Auckland City Hospital. And I got exposed to kidney transplantation. They were very early in starting kidney transplantation here, and it was very obvious to me how transformational an organ transplant was for a patient with renal failure.
Obvious how?
They became utterly transformed in a physical sense, with an improvement in their general health. Firstly, they no longer needed some kind of dialysis or renal support, but as well as not needing to be sort of tied to machinery at times and having restrictive diets, limiting salt and limiting protein and limiting potassium, quite a lot of rigor involved in it.
Loss of quality of life.
Very much a loss of quality of life. And what we saw was a return of quality of life. People literally got younger in front of your eyes. And they said, I can play tennis. I've never been able to play tennis for 20 years and I can play tennis again. Or I can feel my fingertips because I no longer have a sort of neuropathy in my fingertips, and just the sense of touch is improved. My vision is clearer. I sleep better.
Wow.
All sorts of little things. And of course, the way in which that flowed into their relationships with their family. I can have children. I never thought I could have children.
So this was a transformation, you said. for
It
you.
it is a transformation.
And it sparked something for you that
Well, it did, and it sparked it in all of us who were involved in transplantation, the nurses, the seniors, the junior docs, everybody. You could see it, and the patients. It was a very much a miracle, and it wasn't just confined to kidney transplantation, although that was what I was mostly exposed to, because that was what was going on in New Zealand at that time. I mean, this was the late 70s. But the same type of transformation was taking place in different places around the world, where other organ transplantation was very much in its infancy. Heart transplantation had been around for a little while, but it was very tough going. And similarly, liver transplantation was tough going, and done in very few places, and a lot of patients died prematurely after the transplant. It took a long time to learn the science of it, but in all of those cases it was transformational. And so it wasn't just about kidneys, but it was about the process of organ replacement and how that could utterly transform people's lives. But I'd become exposed to intensive care a little bit before I was exposed to renal medicine.
So you've emergency.
I didn't.
You've done, you're an intensivist.
I took a long route to become an intensivist, but when I was finally a medical student, I worked in pediatric infectious diseases, and that was co-located in a building which had the intensive care unit, the general intensive care unit. It was known then as the acute respiratory unit because it began as a respiratory support centre, really. And as part of my paediatric duties, we used to have to cover the ICU as a junior staff.
Closest doctor down the corridor, get in here.
Yeah, there were 3 wards stacked one on top of the other. Right. The ICU was sandwiched in between 2 paediatric ID wards, one upstairs, one downstairs. And so, you could take a kid from upstairs and run them down the stairs, or you could take a kid from upstairs and run them downstairs and run them up the stairs. The ICU was run by a small number of consultants. There were only 3, and they worked their asses off.
So connect me to the organ donation.
Well,
focus.
this is where deceased donation began, because the patients who donated their organs died in the ICU, and I saw patients die in the ICU, and I saw patients in the ICU donate their organs, and so I saw secondhand what it was like for the staff who were managing that process, who were talking with the family, who were looking after the dying patient and liaising with the transplant services and all the other work that was involved in that. But I wasn't personally involved in it at that stage, except as a student, as an observer. But after that, I worked in the ICU as a registrar.
Can I ask you about those conversations, please, Stephen?
Yeah. Well, let me just say,
Sure.
My first conversation of this myself was as a renal registrar, because in those days these conversations were held not by intensivists but by the renal medicine doctors, the people who would be looking after the recipients.
So what's the conversation you had to have?
Well, you had to have a conversation about, this is a situation where your relative could donate their, in this case, kidneys for transplant. And the kidney doctors would have this conversation, and I would sometimes sit in on it and hear what they said. But it was done as a sort of outsider team. So the intensive care team would introduce the family to these people who would come and discuss donation. Later, this whole business changed in the 80s, and the conversation was no longer held by transplant professionals, but it was held by intensive care doctors. It was thought, wrongly, I think, but it was thought with some reasonable a priori justification, that families might think that you were conflicted if you were asking them for discussion about donation. You know, are you really concerned about my relative, or are you just interested in the organs, or maybe you don't want to treat them so intensively?
So in the decades of practice since that you've been at the very forefront of in Aotearoa, New Zealand, right? Where is the conversation now, and where do you believe it's best done? How have you done it when you think this is how it needs to be?
Well, now I think there is a much more clear and established and I won't say defined, because that's not quite the right word, but there's much more of an understanding about what the conversation should entail, and how it might be best done in order that the family is well supported during the process, and that their needs are met, and that they're not, you know, pushed into something that they either don't want to discuss or...
So how is that done? How do you support that family? So it's a pretty intense time. I've my close family member, my partner, my child, my parent is there dying or dead, and this conversation has to happen. How do you support?
Well, I think you have to understand that this conversation takes place not as the first conversation about difficult matters. In fact, compared to the conversations which have gone on in the days before, this is a much easier conversation for everybody.
How? What's a harder conversation than that?
Well, a harder conversation is your family member is likely to die. Maybe tomorrow, maybe tonight, maybe in 2 hours' time. Or maybe after 2 weeks of a struggle. And we're going to have to go through all of this together. You and us and the patient. And this is not an easy journey. And it will be marked by ups and downs, and it will be marked by difficult conversations, and by grief and loss, and, you know, highs and lows. And so the conversation about organ donation occurs after there have been a number of other conversations. It's very, very rare that this is a topic on the first conversation. It does happen, but it's very, very unusual. Mostly it's the second or the third or the fourth or the fifth or whatever family meeting between a senior medical person and the family. And the meeting is also always attended by the bedside nurse who's associated with that patient. You understand that patients in the ICU are nursed on a one-to-one basis. So there'll be a nurse who's responsible for that patient, who will come to all of these meetings.
And what are the expectations of that nurse?
Well, I shouldn't really speak for the nurses, but the nurses see themselves as kaitiaki of the patient and their well-being. So they are, in a sense, they are an advocate for the patient, but they also see themselves as having a very similar role towards the family. They are there to support the patient. The family are at the bedside often for a long time. You know, they may be there for hours. Sometimes, you know, people want to be at the bedside all the time, 24/7. And the nurses obviously are seen by the family doing their work, and they strike up a conversation, and they develop their own personal relationships with those people. They get to know a lot of the dynamics of the family. Where does the patient fit into the family? What's going on in the family which is predating all of this? What baggage do people bring to this? What are the wild cards that you need to watch out for? Even something simple as the name on the patient sticker isn't actually what people call themselves. Yeah. The nurses will always know what the family and the patient call them, And so their role in that is not to be involved in the discussion about organ donation, but to support the family in their grief, and to, as it were, provide an oversight, another pair of eyes to the conversation. And if the conversation is going badly, if the nurse can see, for example, that the family haven't understood what has been said, then they may well interrupt and say something like, I think this needs clarifying, or I'm not sure that you understood this, or I'm not sure that the family understood this. And that gives an opportunity for, slowing the process, and a change of words and change of direction, or maybe a pause, like today is not a day where we should take this conversation further, but we'd like to meet again, perhaps tomorrow.
It sounds, when you are in a time poor, high pressure situation as the clinician, and you have someone whose life can be potentially transformed in the room next door, very frustrating to have these very human, but very frustrating.
No, it's not at all frustrating. It absolutely is not at all frustrating. It's fulfilling. It's only frustrating if you have your own personal agenda, which is overriding the agenda of the people that you're there to serve. You're there to serve these people, the family and the dying patient. And your job is to look after them and do it well, do it, with professionalism and pride and expertise and the best you can bring to it. And to do that, and to have a successful engagement with the family where they do relate to you, and there is really a meeting of minds and a good understanding and sharing of feelings and thoughts, then that's very fulfilling. It's not frustrating at all. If it was easy, someone else would be doing it.
It interests me, as I wish we had a camera on you, because as you said that, your face softened, your eyes came alive, and there's a sense of delight in you around this. But it's hard. Well, it's not easy, but it's not as hard as people make it out to be. People make it out to be hard because they bring all kinds of preconceptions to what they think the conversation will be like. But in fact, it's just an ordinary bunch of people talking to another ordinary bunch of people about a very important life event. And it's not marked by formality or, standoffishness, or it really is. I won't say it's sort of friendly, but it's cordial, and it's about mutual respect and about mutual trust. I'll trust you to be upfront and be honest, and I'll respect you for that. And in a sense,
I expect the same as well. But I have to earn people's trust. It doesn't just come free on a platter.
I imagine it also comes with a hugely varied number of reactions and responses.
Oh, yes, and that's part of the delight, really, is that you've got no bloody idea whatsoever about what you're going to get into. And that's, as I say to people, revel in that, because, if it were easy, if it were programmed, then someone else would be doing it. So it wouldn't be you.
Well,
you have to be creative when you're doing this.
If I was walking into this sort of situation and this conversation, now I work in funeral celebrancy and meet families later, and I meet them in times of grief, and I see a range of reactions, and the things that you talked about with the nurse walking through things, and as my daughter always tells me, when I talk to her about a challenging experience, she says, "Dad, none of us are at our best in grief." She says, "Bring that every time."
Well, I think here am I disagreeing with you again. I think that although she put it, none of us are at our best in grief, I think most of us are in our best at grief, are at our best in grief. And that is that most people in grief, with their grief, strip away a whole lot of the defense and the, what you might call aggressive defense that they have. And they perhaps without wanting to, or perhaps without meaning to, they reveal parts of themselves that normally they keep hidden. And in that sense, that's what I mean by you see people at their best.
Okay.
They let their guard down. They share things that they may not have told anybody about. Private conversations that they've had with other family members or with the dying patient, or experiences from their childhood or their own difficult relationships, all sorts of stuff you hear about. And when they do, and they realize it's okay to do that, I don't get judged for it. I just get it listened, and I get to see that people understand me. Then that's what I mean. You get to see people at their best. And the same thing happens among the staff. When people share those kinds of things with professionals, the professionals rise to the occasion too. And they think, I can do good here. I can do better here.
You've advocated for decades around organ donation, and led and delivered it, but for clinicians at in all levels and parts of this process to commit to and be part of organ donation, there's a new skill set. They have to learn new skills.
There is,
but
those
what
skills.
Response have you found from your peers? I mean, are they overwhelmingly enthusiastic? Are they like, I like the idea, but it's very difficult?
I think two things. There's a spectrum of reaction, and secondly, people move over time quite quickly. When shown that this is not as hard as your fears may have, and you already have 90% of the skill set to do this, and what you really need is a little encouragement and support, and maybe a little bit of teaching, coaching perhaps more than anything, about an understanding of what the family might be going through, just in a general sense, and also about how is it possible to choose words which are plain and simple and unambiguous and sensitive and focused on the patient and the family and not on the organ and the recipient. Because this is the context that you're talking in. You're not talking in the context of a recipient needing an organ. You're talking in the context of a family losing a family member. And once people have these concepts explained to them and have learnt a few phrases and a few words to say and not say, then they approach these conversations with initially much more equanimity and then with a sense of adventure, you know?
No.
It's like you're standing at the seaside and you're about to climb into a sailing ship and you're going to sail across the Mediterranean and you're going to go via a whole bunch of offshore islands as you do. They might be Greek, they might be Italian, they might be, you know, from North Africa, but you're going to bounce around off these things. And eventually you're going to get to the toe of Italy or somewhere. But exactly how you get there, it's not possible to predict at the beginning. You might find that there are dragons or that there's an offshore wind or, you know, some pirate comes out of the left field and torpedoes your boat. It's like that. But be confident. You may not know the route, but you've sailed the Mediterranean. You've fought pirates. You know, you've learned how to hide round the back of islands when the weather gets bad. At the worst, maybe you could throw an anchor down and stay put in the shade for 24 hours until it blows over and then set sail again. You don't have to do it all in one day. And so when people understand these kinds of concepts, then it's a challenge and it's an adventure. And
your eyes are sparkling again.
And, you know, how did it go? Well, it was fantastic, people say. It was fantastic. You know, I had no idea what was going to happen. And this is what happened. And it's an amazing story. And you get lots of those. And once people have had that themselves a couple of times, or they've seen it as another member watching the conversation, because obviously the registrars and the nurses, you know, they go and sit in on this, then they change too. You know, they think, yeah, this is something we can do. And this is something which would be good for our department. And yeah, maybe it's not actually easy, but, you know, we're good. We can do it. And that gives us pride in our work.
It's, as you're talking through both the professional and the clinical side, and I'm also reflecting still on the family experience or the decision making of those who are, you know, caring about the patient. They're very parallel processes, aren't they? Or you can disagree with me again.
No, I don't think I disagree. No. Yeah, they are parallel processes. I mean, they're sort of reciprocating.
How does, if I have made the decision with whoever else is around me that my loved relative or partner or whomever donates their organs, how do we ever get to that experience that you've just described for the medical team of like, you know what, it was wonderful? Does that ever happen?
Yes, it does. But I think you need to understand two things. Firstly, that the degree of wonderful is not dependent on whether or not the family choose to donate or not. And that's a difficult concept for people to understand. But it lies at the root of a lot of this. It lies at the root of the expectation problem. That is, To donate is good, to not donate is bad. And therefore, if the family decides to donate, that's good. And if the family decides not to donate, that's bad. And if something is good, then I'm good. And if something is bad, then that's bad. And I'm bad. And I've done bad. And that's entirely the wrong thing to be doing, because that brings your judgments and your expectations into the conversation and gives it primacy, even if it's hidden. It may not be hidden as much as you think. The family will see it, and you will know it deep in your heart, and you will show it on your face, and you will wear it when you go home, and all the rest of it. And you will not want to have that conversation again.
So what does wonderful look like if I've overcome the expectation problem?
Wonderful looks like you end the meeting, you end the encounter with a sense that the correct process was carried out and the family made the decision that was right for them and their loved one, whatever that decision was. But the other point I wanted to make was the use of the term decision, because this is very problematic in discourse. It has to do with the peculiar status of bodies after death. When you're dead, you're no longer capable of decision making. A dead body can't make a decision. In fact, a dead body can't perform any action upon the world without it being done by somebody else on their behalf. And unlike material property, you do not own your body in the sense that you have full rights and responsibilities to dispose of material property. You can bequeath a house or a motor vehicle or a pot of money to somebody, and in law that can be enforceable.
Can I not bequeath my body?
You cannot bequeath it in the sense that it can be disposed of entirely in a way that you want it to be done. There are certain rules and laws and customs about how bodies are disposed of.
Okay, so coming back to this decision, which
yes,
is problematic.
Decision. Yeah, people
word.
say, I've made a decision, I'm an organ donor. That's what people say.
I've said that.
Yeah. But you're not an organ donor. You're somebody who would like to see your organs donated after death. You're only an organ donor after you're dead and your body has been operated on to have organs removed.
And donated, yeah, okay.
And that's what at that point you are a donor. Prior to that, you might be what's called, you might be a potential donor. We all are.
Yeah, I'm willing, I'm enthusiastic.
I'm willing, I'm enthusiastic, yes. But it doesn't just involve me. It involves a whole lot of people around me, my family.
Yeah, I'm hopeful I die before my daughter, and hopefully she'll just go, yep, that's what Dad wanted.
Well, she may say, hell no, I don't want that. It's not, I couldn't bear it.
She's quite, all right. Okay.
I couldn't bear it.
Okay.
Now, admittedly, this is made an enormous amount of by utilitarians and what I call sort of fundamentalist thinkers from the left and the right. But in fact, if and when there has been a good conversation between the person who would like to be a donor — nobody really wants to be a donor, they want to live forever, but if they wanted be a donor after their death, if they've had a good conversation with their family and they've come to a mutual understanding, then most of the time, and I mean 85, 90% of the time, but not all the time, the viewpoints will be congruent. And the viewpoint that people had in theory, weeks before, months before, persists afterwards, although there may be some changes in the meantime. But sometimes it doesn't happen, and sometimes it doesn't happen in both directions. Sometimes, as I said, there's the I can't bear it. A lot of these things are best told in anecdote, and this is a true one, that a young woman in her 40s, early 40s, had a cerebral hemorrhage, a rupture of an artery in the brain, bleeding into the brain, and became brain dead. And she and her husband had discussed organ donation in theory, a couple of years beforehand, and were both very clear about it, that she wanted it and he wanted to make sure that happened if he was asked, and vice versa. He wanted it and she would do the same. But they didn't talk to their teenage girls. The kids were too young. They were 13 and 15 or something at the time that the parents had the conversation. Can I just say, perfectly old enough to involve the kids. And I can say that from personal experience. My kids were involved in this conversation with me when they were 10. And I think you could probably involve children even younger than that in an understanding of what goes on. If they're not so freaked out about the concepts of death and so on and so forth. Kids have got a much clearer pathway to the truth. But to go back to this family, they didn't talk to the girls. So when it came to the time when Mum had died, and the question is, should she donate organs, the girls said to their father, I can't bear it. And he, of course, was doubly and triply distressed. He was distressed at his wife's death. He was distressed at the fact that his girls were distressed. He was distressed at the fact that he did not think that he could donate his wife's organs. And he was distressed to think that if he did fulfill his wife's wishes, this would be a lifelong change to his relationship with his daughters, which was, of course, going to need to persist long after their mother had died. And, it comes as no surprise to you when I tell you the story that you think, oh yeah, I can understand that this is a situation where it's very clear what the person wanted. It's very clear what the husband wanted, but it didn't happen. But not for gratuitous random reasons, but for reasons having to do with the persistence of relationship between that father and his daughters and his grandchildren and so on for generations.
And Mum and their daughter's relationship with Mum.
Absolutely. Yeah, all of that. And there are other examples the other way. I'll give you a classic example which was very distressing to me, actually, and to the family. I talked to this family about organ donation, and they said, he didn't want any of that, and he'd made it clear to us all. And he even put it on his driver's license that he didn't want to be a donor. And he made sure that we all knew that. I said, in those conversations with you, did he tell you why he he felt that way. And they said, oh, yes, we didn't have to ask him. He told us preemptively. He told us because he said, I've smoked all my life. I've been a heavy drinker. I have abused my body sort of vastly, and the organs have been no good to anybody. And out of a sense of propriety and out of a sense of misplaced caritas for potential recipients.
Caritas?
Charity, guardianship, looking after their interests. Okay. I wouldn't want them to get my organs because they're bloody crappy. And, that wouldn't be good for them. And I can't have that. I couldn't have that on my conscience to think that my organs could be put into somebody and that they'd be no good. Well, that wouldn't happen anyway, as you could well imagine. But that's what the person's thinking was. But then I said to the family, well, I appreciate that, but in the interests of clarity, I'm going to tell you that several of his organs would be able to be transplanted, despite the history that you tell me, because although he may have smoked, he's one of those people who, and we see them, can have 40-pack years of cigarettes and not end up with terrible lung function. And similarly, although he'd been a heavy drinker, and in fact he has got a fatty liver which would not work well in recipients, he's got perfectly normal kidneys. And by the way, he could probably donate his heart too. And they said, well, goodness me, we think that if he knew all that, he would want to donate. And we would like him to donate too, because we think it's a great idea. But because he made it so clear to us what he wanted, it would disrupt a relationship that we had with him of trust and respect to do what he wanted, to do other than what he wanted, I mean. And so we don't want him to donate, even though we think it's what he would want and it's what we would want. Wow. And I mean, I came out of that, as you could imagine, feeling sort of wheels within wheels, and the world is spinning and you can never quite predict what's going on. But at the end of all of that, if I ask the question, was the process done right, and was the decision made which was right for the family in their context, then yes, it was. So it was a surprising outcome in terms of donation, but the actual event that took place on the day, there was good contact between the healthcare team and the family. They were grateful. They were truly grateful for the opportunity to discuss it in this way. And they were relieved to hear the truth of the matter. So when I get back to this business of decision, people make decisions, as they call them, about organ donation in a state of often ignorance about what organ donation involves, what organs might be transplanted, what the outcome of those organs might be, what the effect on their healthcare might be, what the effect on the family might be. They don't know any of those things, but they make an arbitrary decision. They think transplantation is good, organ donation must be good, I want to be an organ donor, end of story. It's a very information devoid decision making. I have advocated and I still think that there's a lot of truth in this, that the best situation to discuss organ donation with a family is where they've never talked about it and they don't even know that it exists. And so there's zero preconceptions. And so for the first time, you can present actually what the reality is, slowly, and work it through in a dynamic way with the family on the spot. And I'll give you another anecdote that explains this. It occurred to one of my colleagues who I worked with for many, many years, who was very, very good at talking with families. He had a gift of being trustworthy in his face, as he was. It was just genuinely him. He was just like that. And people liked him. He had a certain star quality, I guess. And in fact, he had a star quality that saw him do TV interviews for various things. He was a good spokesperson in that regard. But he came to me one day and he said, "Look, Stephen, I'm going to go and talk to this family of this person who's brain dead, and I'm a bit apprehensive about it." He says, "I have no real idea about what to do." And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Well, he is from Laos, and he's Buddhist, and the family are Buddhist, and he's only been in this country for about a year, and they have just come to the bedside from Laos over the last several days, and they had no idea about organ donation. They didn't even know that transplantation took place. They'd never been in an intensive care unit. They'd never heard about the concept of brain death. They don't understand how it might be that he could be dead and be ventilated. There's just no context. And by the way, they don't speak English. None of them do. And I said, "Oh, that's quite a handful." But I suggest that you do what you normally do. Firstly, find yourself a translator. And again, this is one of the things I'm worried about with respect to our election. These services are essential and valuable and expensive.
So find the translator.
To find a translator.
Yeah, so I'm just
find a translator.
Yep.
Find a translator and have a meeting, just you and the nurse and the translator, and say, explain to everybody what the situation is, and that you don't know quite how far down this conversation you're going to get, but it's possible that you'll take this conversation all the way to organ donation, if everybody is in line with that, and that you would like the translator to translate. You don't want the translator to interpret. You want the translator to be very precise in saying the words that you say and not trying to soften it for the family's benefit or,
yeah, great guidance. Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. So then you go into the meeting and just carry out the normal meeting. And I mean, we all have slightly different ways in which we do this, but my way was similar to his. And in general, you go into the room. You have a room which is big enough. In this case, there was about 10 people of the family, including not just family members who'd come from Laos, but sort of local members of the Laotian community who'd come along to sort of support the family. They weren't there to help make decisions, but they were there to look after them. So the first part of the meeting is introductions. Who am I? Who are these people? And I always say it would be helpful to me if I understood who each of you are and your relationship to whoever the patient's name is. And that gives an opportunity for people to say who they are, and it gives you an initial insight into some of the family dynamics and some of the emotional states that are going on, or even some of the misconceptions that are going on. But it also is it slows the meeting down. It says this is a serious meeting. People are actually, I'm not just here to hand you a flyer or a piece of information. We're actually going to have person-to-person conversation here of quite serious nature. And that might take 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And then you need to explain to the family, just like what you'd explain to the translator, what's the patient's circumstance. And if that means you have to explain what brain death is, well, you have to explain what brain death is, just like you do to any other family. And it's not difficult to explain. To give you an example, the brain dies because its blood flow is cut off. And its blood flow is cut off because the brain is inside a closed box and some bleeding and swelling has happened within the brain. And that has got so tight inside that box that blood can't get into the brain. And because blood can't get into the brain dies, just like any other tissue that's deprived of its blood flow. But because the person has been ventilated, in fact was ventilated before their brain died, and before they stopped breathing, then the machine continues to pump air in and out of their lungs, and the dumb heart keeps pumping the blood around. But there's no involvement of the person's brain in any of this. So they look pink and warm, and their chest is rising, and you can feel a pulse at the wrist. And you can see the skin perfusion. If you sort of lean on the skin, it blanches and it pinks up again when you take your fingers off. So there is a sort of semblance of life, but the person is dead. Their brain is dead completely, and they will never recover. And this Laotian family, and just about every Kiwi family I speak with, except those that are the odd kind of religious nuts, they understand this. It's very easy to understand. And they got to this bit, and then at this point they asked quite rightly, well, what happens now? And as you say, well, at some stage it would be appropriate, it would be the right thing to take the ventilator. And we know what will happen. The person doesn't breathe, and within 5 minutes their heart will notice this and they'll go blue, and within a short period of time after that, 15, 30 minutes, their heart will stop. And they'll look dead just like everybody else looks dead outside of the ICU. That's what will happen. But before that happens, it is possible that they could donate their organs. And this would involve going to the operating room with an operating team, not an intensive care team, another team, who would respectfully, and in the same way that one does when operating on these organs, remove those organs and preserve them by perfusing certain fluids through them and cooling them down. And then later on, yet another team will take those organs and put them into whichever recipients are most suitable. And those organs may well go to people in different parts of New Zealand, But also we have an exchange program with Australia, and if there's nobody suitable in New Zealand, for example, then those organs would go to Australia and vice versa.
This is a lot of information to take in.
It is a lot of information, and this kind of amount of information, if you need to go into it to this degree, takes between 20 and 45 minutes.
Yeah, so what happened?
They listened to all of this, and they said, we'd like to just talk about this amongst ourselves for a little while. So sort of 5 minutes later, he got a call, go back in again. And they said, we think that's a wonderful thing.
Wow. And you're emotional about it.
Oh, yes.
But you've been through this how many times?
Oh, hundreds of times. But that was the most traumatic example of somebody who had zero understanding, zero preconceptions, zero sort of myths. They just listened to everything that went on, and they thought about it in their Buddhist way, and they thought it was a great thing. I don't know how much the Buddhist business made a difference. The concept of life in Buddhism is somewhat different from what we're accustomed to in a Judeo-Christian world.
Stephen, you're moved by this. You've got tears rolling down your cheeks.
Well, it's all just, isn't it part of the most wonderful aspects of, human diversity and people's goodness? That you can find these kinds of experiences in the sort of high-tech world of modern medicine.
What is it about the experience that moves you so?
Well, I think I'd have to say it has to do with people's ability to be the best they can be at a time when it would seem to be the worst for them. That's what's so moving.
And you've seen it again and again.
Again and again.
That's At a Loss. Conversations with me, funeral celebrant Timothy Giles. If you've got feedback to share, or, well, we all have experiences around grief, around loss, around life and death. If you want to be part of the conversation, email me, listengiles@gmail.com. That's Giles with a G. listengiles@gmail.com.